I'm Kate Seeley with the Middle East Institute. Welcome back to the last and one of the most interesting panels of the day. We've talked, everybody, if you could please sit down. We've talked throughout the day about what Egyptians can do to move forward on their political path, to work toward greater stability, greater democracy, greater prosperity. We've talked about what Egyptians can do to work toward national reconciliation, healing the wounds, healing the divide. We've talked about how Egyptians can work to meet the demands and needs of the people for bread, freedom, and social justice. Now we want to change tack and talk a little bit about what the international community can do to help Egypt along on its path toward greater stability, prosperity, and democracy. We have with us today a panel of academics and analysts who have been writing extensively on the U.S.-Egyptian relationship and are well-placed to discuss this topic with us today. I will start on our moderator's left. We have Amy Hawthorne. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where she's been writing on Egypt. Before joining the Atlantic Council, she was an appointee at the U.S. Department of State, advising on U.S. policy toward the Arab Spring countries. Next to her is Mohamed Elmenshawy. He is the Director of Languages at the Middle East Institute. He's also a scholar at MEI, and he is a very well-known columnist for the Egyptian paper El Shurouk. Next to him, we have Dr. Abdel Saeed, who's chairman of the board and CEO of Masry Youm Publishing House and director of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Cairo. And then Jason Brownlee, associate professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin, where he teaches Mideast politics. This panel is in the very, very capable hands of Michael Wahid Hanna, who's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where he's written extensively on the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. So, Michael, I'd like to hand the panel over to you. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's a real privilege and an honor.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks everybody for persevering to the end of the day. And it'll be my job to agitate our panelists, so maybe we'll get a little argument to keep you awake as well. Egypt, obviously, from the start of the Arab uprisings, was seen as the sort of center of gravity. And the outside world believed that what happened in Egypt, because of its demographic weight, its historical role in the Arab world, would have profound implications not just for Egypt, but for the region. And for that reason, singled out the transition in Egypt and its potential success as something that the international community wanted to prioritize. The international community and the United States has not always been able to adjust to these changing times, and the results of international interaction and engagement with Egypt are clearly something of a mixed bag, and at times have yielded very disappointing results from the perspective of the international community. And I would like to start with Abdel, and I'd just like to ask whether Egypt really wants international support. In the wake of the popular uprising of June 30th, the military intervention of July 3rd, we've seen a mood of hyper-nationalism sweep across the country, where state media has stigmatized foreign countries, chief among them the United States, has stigmatized contacts with those countries, and has suggested far-flung conspiracies about the rest of the world and the intentions of the rest of the world vis-a-vis Egypt. This suggests a somewhat complicated picture. Based on this current mood, does Egypt think that its relations with the outside world are important? And does it care about outside assistance and international support?
Let me start by thanking the Middle East Institute for inviting me here, and thank you for letting me to start this discussion. And I will tell you that Egypt cannot stay away from the rest of the international community. I'm sure a lot of Egyptians got a lot of problems that will need in some way or another to have good relations with other countries. The issue is, what is the framework that we are talking about? What kind of relations that we want with the United States in particular? Which some Egyptians will do what, will say what, if you remember Fiddler on the Roof in the 1970s, in which the gentleman at the time said, long live the Tsar, but keep him away from us. So there is that fear of that, to have the international community using the opportunity of Egyptian mounting problems in order to take off what the most important thing that Egyptians like to have, which is their independence. And that kind of independence got to be translated into a certain framework, and I will emphasize his Egyptian-American relationship. President Obama said recently that we cannot keep the relationship with Egypt as business as usual. The business as usual never was defined. What is the business we have between the United States and Egypt? And do we have business, or do we have a number of values that the United States want to implement in Egypt? And I think the long list of business that we have often completely ignored. I mean, here, when we talk about the United States in particular, and other the international community, if you want to make it a frame of a relationship based on sovereignty, it's based on reciprocity of interests. And in the case of the United States, there is a long list of American interests in Egypt as well. I mean, usually the debate about Egypt and relationship with the United States is centered around the aid. Should we cut off aid or not to cut off aid? I never was in my life enthusiastic about American aid to Egypt, but it was important, it was helping. However, that was in exchange of a lot of interests in Egypt. Part of the business in Egypt, something called overflight. And in a country that made 2 major wars in the last year, overflights was an important interest for the United States in Egypt. Having access and easy access, and in a way, first to run access to the Suez Canal was a major interest for a country that has a lot of battleships and nuclear ships that got to go and get secured from the Suez Canal. In a country that's making with Egypt a surplus in the balance of trade of $4 billion, that's also an interest. So in the American debate, actually, and some of it I heard it today, was completely different from the kind of debates that we have back in Cairo. And regarding this particular point, that this relationship got to be A, based on interest, 2, reciprocity. And in that sense, I think I call here, I use the opportunity, that we need a serious dialogue about an assessment of Egyptian-American relations that has been enduring for about 40 years now, and it was helping the interests of both countries. But I found in the past few weeks, probably a couple months, that this relationship is coming into a stage of tension that's got to be explored and investigated by this panel.
Jason, maybe you could touch now perhaps on what you think those interests are and perhaps what they should be, and assess for us what this bilateral relationship looks like and where it's gone wrong perhaps from both sides.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on a question that Kate raised in her opening remarks about where the relationship should go from here and what international actors can be doing, I think answering that question begins with a sober assessment of what the United States has done in the past and what it's done wrong in the past when it comes to Egypt. And I think there are 2 key areas, 2 big mistakes the U.S. has historically made in its relations with Egypt. One of them is to minimize and neglect and not take seriously public opinion inside of Egypt. And the second is to support the kind of stability that was talked about in the first panel because it's kind of convenient, sort of authoritarian stability, and not take seriously the long-term risks of that type of an arrangement. This is, if we want to talk about business as usual between the U.S. and Egypt, I'm not sure at this point if it has really changed, although Obama has said it's going to change. I mean, business as usual between Egypt and the U.S. means basically what Martin Indyk called the bargain, which is the U.S. supports authoritarian rulers in Egypt, and they, in turn, suppress extremist Islamists. And the problem with that, that bargain during the past 40 years is that it produces people like Omar Abdul Rahman. It produces people like Ayman Zawahiri. And it produces people like Mohamed Atta. So I think the strategic benefits that Abdul Menahem raises, while continue to have some value, but they're actually much less valuable than they were during the Cold War. I think the importance of Bright Star has shrunk significantly, for example. Those are the biennial war games between Egypt and that Egypt and the U.S. participate in. And I think if we do a fresh cost-benefit analysis of the traditional U.S.-Egyptian partnership, we may find, from just a realpolitik perspective on the American side, that it would make sense to change things.
In the midst of what is obviously a nationalistic moment, pro-military order emerging, there's been a contradiction in the sense that suggestions that the aid relationship be reformed or changed are also met with nationalistic fury. And yet this is obviously a type of dependent relationship. There's a bit of a contradiction there. Mohamed, maybe you could touch upon the nature of that complicated relationship where you have a military who's the biggest beneficiary of American aid, and yet a broader political climate where foreign entanglements are being stigmatized. Clearly a strange dichotomy there.
Sure. Let's just remind everybody that Egypt received in the last 30 to 33 years about $76 billion in aid, military aid and economic aid. And average Egyptian won't feel any enjoyment or any pleasure of this $76 billion aid because most of them went to the military and we don't know what happened exactly beside. We have strong military, that's yes, but we don't see it in daily life or affecting every Egyptian people. This equation between Egyptian and American relation was based on aid for cooperation. That's lasted for last 33 years, since 1979. And I believe the last event in last 2 months proved this equation need to be revisited completely. And business as usual, which aid for cooperation doesn't work anymore in this changing dynamics of Egyptian politics. Internal policy of Egypt was not so significant to the relation between the two sides. As Jason said, the public opinion of Egyptian was not on the table for American and Egyptian side as well. Nowadays it is. It's a big factor for everybody, even for the military, for Muslim Brotherhood, for the liberal Egyptian voice is to be heard. And 82% of Egyptians don't want any kind of aid from United States. So if we are talking about reflecting the desire of Egyptian people, aid should be stopped because that's what most Egyptians want. I believe that's a very romantic request, yet the equation should be changed. The structural relation was based on three foundations. Regional security. Egypt played an important role in Arab-Israeli conflict, yet it's very much marginalized recently. Played an important role against Iran, serving US indirect interest in this topic. It doesn't work anymore. Egypt's most strong ally, Saudi Arabia and Emirates, have strong relation with Iran. Egypt is the third country after Israel and the United States doesn't have a full relation with Iran as of today. Second foundation for the relation was military-to-military relation. And here, the US establishment, I believe, they thought they have serious leverage and influence over Egyptian military. Last 2 months' experience showed that to be a wrong assumption. When the Egyptian Minister of Defense here or Secretary of Defense, Sheikh Hagel, called each other day almost his counterpart in Egypt, General Sisi, and asked him clearly, don't use violence to disperse the sit-in of Rabaa and in Nahda, and he did exactly the opposite, and nothing happened in terms of the changing the equation of the relation as we speak. Stopping shipping of 6 or 4 F-16 jets and some Apache helicopter, but no serious discussion in Washington of stopping the aid. And at least I proposed in one of my articles freezing the aid for 7 months. Egyptian military said there is 9 months transition. We have full democracy by that time. So I would recommend to freeze this aid for 9 months, stopping the military-to-military relation, no contact between the top officers on both sides, which very much will send serious message to military of Egypt. It's business not as usual. We need serious democratic process that should include Islamists. U.S. interest is to have stable Egypt for what it means for the region, for the global security and regional security, and excluding Islamists. I believe it's a fatal mistake. You will not have a stable Egypt. It will be indirect hurt and damage to U.S. interest, and I would love to freeze the aid, freeze military-to-military contact, unless we have successful transition, and 7 months left based on the roadmap announced in Cairo. And I would like to see inclusive process that include Islamists, and then I will resume the aid and change the structure of the relation, because the old version of the relation doesn't work anymore.
So Mohamed is positing it on one level that the U.S. has shown that it has limited influence on political events in Egypt. And so in your estimation, Amy, if in fact aid was suspended, one, would the U.S. have influence, and would it actually change the direction, the trajectory of political events in the country?
I don't think that if the United States suspends military and or economic aid. Is that better? I don't think that if the U.S. Makes the decision to suspend military or economic aid, it actually will have any short-term influence over the decision-making of the Egyptian authorities. They're going to do what they think is in the best interest of their country. But over the longer term, I think it could make a contribution to Egypt's political evolution, which is a very complex process that is mainly dependent on domestic factors, but international factors always play a role in every country's internal political developments, whether the country wants to acknowledge that or not. Okay, how's that? So I think what's important for the United States right now is to actually take steps that make its own position and its policy, our policy, much more clear, even if in doing so we don't have an immediate effect on Egyptian government decision-making or Egyptian public opinion. I think that the U.S.-Egyptian relationship has been
Okay.
the Egyptian military. I think the U.S.-Egyptian relationship has been adrift and has been lacking in clarity and lacking in strategic focus for a long time. At the time of the January 25th revolution, that was a moment for the United States and Egypt to try to refashion the relationship into something that made more sense for the new Egypt and made more sense for U.S. interests that go beyond security and strategic interests. The foundational event, the key element of the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, the Camp David followed by the peace treaty, is something that is really a distant memory now for the vast majority of Egyptians who are much too young to remember it. It's not a really meaningful event in Egyptian public consciousness. And it doesn't mean so much for the United States in a daily way either. Of course, it's very important to U.S. interests, but it no longer serves as an animating force, a real strategic guiding partnership for the U.S. and Egypt. So I think that at the time of the revolution, the United States should have started to restructure its relationship to Egypt, to have it include goals that go beyond security and strategic cooperation. That didn't happen for reasons that we can discuss later on the panel. But now I think the United States faces a real moment of truth where we have to make a decision about what is really important to us with respect to Egypt. And for that reason, I think we should suspend aid until Egypt is much more clearly on a democratic path. And that will at least make it clear that the U.S. long-term interest in Egypt includes a successful democratic process, that is really something that's in the U.S. interest. And that if we continue military aid, if we continue business as usual, the signal that we will be sending is that we accept what the Egyptian government is doing. And I don't think that the United States government should send that signal. I think we should send a different signal.
Yeah, I think, just to continue on this line of thinking, we can just ask the question, what does, since we're kind of U.S. focused right now, what does the U.S., what does Washington want from Egypt right now? And it doesn't have much to do with the peace treaty, because that's basically self-sustaining at this point. It doesn't have much to do with overflight rights and Suez Canal passage rights, because, I mean, just frankly, that's not a big priority. The main priority would simply be, you know, to Assisi, one request: please do not create more terrorists. Like, please, full stop. Don't create more terrorists. So basically, do not reproduce the exact domestic policies and repression of the Mubarak era that we went through in the 1990s and that led to such a horrible spiral of violence. So I would say, you know, if people in this town were serious about kind of fighting a war on terrorism, that would be the top priority.
This kind of talk that I just heard, that's enough to infuriate a lot of Egyptians, and really will make a lot of things in the Egyptian-American track is much more tense than it is now. One factor that's completely excluded from that kind of logic, that there is something called Egyptian patriotism. And country as old as Egypt, and the Gata Revolution talked about human dignity. The idea that, you know, the Minister of Defense of the United States called the Minister of Defense in Egypt and asked him to stop doing that or doing that, I think that's exactly what Egypt witnessed for 70 years with the British occupation and with privileges for big and foreign countries. That is something is not, I don't think it is not in the agenda in Egypt right now, whether for the revolutionaries or for the reformers like me, although the word reformers are not considered very well nowadays. However, I have another suggestion, that we need to define our relationship. Are we partners? Are we strategic allies? Are we enemies? Are we friends? These terms I know. I mean, these things are, you know, I can define what the relationship between the United States and Italy, what the United States and Turkey, what the United States and Thailand, with any other country in the world. And that's what I want the Egyptian-American relations to be exactly like. I mean, we don't want a privileged relationship that leads to orders coming from Washington to Cairo. We can talk, we can negotiate, we can ask and seek common interests. Actually, many of the facts that was said, we in the 1990s warned the United States over and over and over again with how terrorism is rising, since actually a Cold War event called the war in Afghanistan against the Russians. So there was a cooperation, and there was to get the jihadists into Afghanistan. And we cooperated with that with the United States. But as we get into the 90s, we were hit in Egypt by a wave of terror. And we warned and warned and warned the United States of these terrorists. And the result was that the United States invited Omar Abdurrahman to come to New York and to live in New Jersey and start his first, you know, bombardment of the World Trade Center. I mean, that was not our doing to give him a visa to the United States. It was not that Mohamed Atta was living in Hamburg. He was not in Egypt. He was in Hamburg when the Hamburg Cell was formulated. So here it was the international community, for reasons that needs, you know, a lot of hours to discuss, that helped in creating certain brand of people that they think that they can change the world into a better place or an Islamic place or an Islamic caliphate. And these people are after us now. Again, you know, I was one of the people who came to Washington in February 2003 and warned against the Iraq War. In many of the lectures we made, and sometimes in official second track kind of messages, that it shouldn't happen. That the issue between the United States and Egypt is like this. Either they consider Egypt a state or consider to be a kind of a satellite something.
Well, I mean, there are warnings now coming from the other side. Those warnings were not listened to from the United States. We saw a fairly disastrous decade of foreign policy in the region by the United States. But now there are warnings coming from the United States. Clearly, the U.S. has a divergence of opinion about what is happening in Egypt, an understanding of the dangers represented by the current course. If this is a relationship of equals, isn't your ally and friend given a fair hearing? why the complete divergence in understanding the objective reality of what's happening. When you see the theory of the case on the United States side and many of its allies in the Western world, you come away with a very different fundamental reading about the basic dynamics of what's happening in Egypt than you have on the Egyptian side. We have two quite different narratives about what's happening in Egypt.
If you allow me a couple minutes just to define what are the lines here.
Okay.
In the United States, you look at Egypt as a crisis like the one, say, in Syria or in Somalia, in which you have parties and usually got to be inclusive with each other and live happily ever after. That's not the case in Egypt. In Egypt is a very existential issue. I mean, we are talking about the moment in which Abraham Lincoln faced before the Civil War, in which the United States lost 600,000 people, when it was the identity of the state, the Declaration of Independence, was under severe threat from the southern states. Egypt is living exactly in the moment of 1933 in Germany, of 1979 in Iran, in which countries are faced with a historical, existential moment in which you have to decide what to do with the state itself. Luckily, the basic values of what we have in Egypt, the basic values of what people are trying to do, succeeding or failing will depend on a lot of factors. Not one of them is the United States. But, you know, that is the Egyptian movement, revolution, whatever you call it, is seeking a democratic, civic, and modern state. That is the idea that the founding fathers of Egypt in 1922 put for Egypt. Since then, we have failed and succeeded, and the evaluation of that will be left to history. However, I don't think that there is any question in the United States about these three goals. And I think if we are as partners, not as followers or dependents or anything, we can come into terms of what should be done in Egypt. We hear today that, you know, there is a roadmap, and this roadmap could be, you know, the proof in the pudding here. I will not say that the United States will have a saying in Egypt if it cut the military aid or whatever aid for any certain period of time. I said in the beginning that I never was enthusiastic about the American aid for economic and for, you know, other reasons. But I found that to use to pressure them, to make them do the right thing, make sure to do something that will guarantee a backlash. Don't forget the 1950s.
Mohamed, do you agree with that general description of
Unfortunately, no. Generally, I don't agree with what Dr. Said said. The state of Egypt, it's a mess. This state has failed in the last 6 decades. The Republic of 1952, the military make people believe they owe him the independence of the British colony. They owe him the establishment of the Republic. It's a mess. The state failed in the last 6 years. Literacy in Egypt in 2013 in Arabic language is about 40%. In 2013, 40% of Egyptians can't speak or write their name. They can't ride a bus because they can't read the bus number. They are non-functional. They can't. And that is the result of the state Dr. Said mentioned. The state he talks about, I believe I will call it the Cairo elite. This elite who rule the state and the state serves them, none of them or their kids go to public school, state school, public hospital, or public transportation. Now, financially, I belong to this state. My son will never ride a public transportation in Egypt. Like most Cairo elite who controls the state, and the state serves their interest in 60 years, and now we want this revision of this state to serve the same Cairo elite again. I believe it's failed. It's time for change. We wished revolution against Mubarak will change, but we failed. Morsi failed us as well, and now we are returning the clock to the back. We need to serve the state. The state really is a mess, doesn't even deserve to exist. It's not Norway, it's Cairo, Egypt, Upper Egypt, which really most Cairan can't even communicate with people from Sinai. And that's why we have this crisis in Sinai. It's not terrorism. Terrorism is that's the last chapter of this crisis. I talked to people from Sinai, I'm from Cairo, I'm very foreign to them. These people in Sinai can't own land, can't work, can't access Sharm el-Sheikh, can't go to public beach there. Cairo elite owns everything in northern coast from West Alexandria to Libya in Sharm el-Sheikh, and they want to use the state and reproduce Mubarak regime in more young form, more smart army, because they learned from SCAF disasters in the last 18 months, and now we want to defend the state. The state failed Egyptian people, as I understand. 8 million Egyptians are abroad because of this failed state. So reproducing the state, I believe, is just insulting to all Egyptians.
Is it working? Is this working? Okay, good. With all due respect to Dr. Abdel Monem, from where I sit, I think the real existential threat to Egypt is not Islamists, it's not the Muslim Brotherhood, notwithstanding the disaster, the complete disaster that was Morsi's tenure in power. The real existential threat is poverty, ignorance, underdevelopment, Egyptians who are not treated with dignity and respect, who are tortured and abused by their government, who don't have jobs, whose government doesn't make efforts to build a better life for them, all the things that Mohamed mentioned. That is the real existential threat to Egypt, and that is the crime that Egyptians have suffered under for decades. This is not the responsibility of the United States to solve this problem. In my view, there are things that we can do to help, there are things that we can do to hurt. It's really Egyptians' responsibility, but I think we should be clear on what the real problems facing Egypt are. And in that regard, yes, Egypt and the United States will continue to cooperate going forward on security and strategic matters. Those are very important interests to the United States. They're very important to the Egyptian government, and they have been for a long time, and they'll continue to be. But in my view, what we can't have with this Egyptian government is a partnership. In my view, when there is an Egyptian government that takes genuine steps toward a democratic civic state, and a humane state, and a state that respects the rights of its citizens. That is the kind of Egyptian state that the United States can build a partnership, a close relationship with all the benefits that that brings. In the meantime, I would never argue for cutting relations. I don't even necessarily think we should permanently cut our aid program, and we will have close strategic cooperation, because Egypt doesn't do those things because it's a client state of the United States. Egypt is a proud country, and it knows what its strategic interests are, and it cooperates with the United States on the things that are in its own interest, and that's how it should be. Egypt doesn't pursue counterterrorism in the Sinai or peace with Israel because of $1 billion in US military aid. No, Egypt pursues those things because its leadership thinks that that is in Egypt's interest. So those things will continue. But beyond that, I think this is a moment where the United States should pull back, should reassess, should stop and think about how it wants to position itself with the Egypt that is emerging. I think it's also clear from what my colleague said that most Egyptians at this moment don't want the United States to pursue a close partnership with it. So I think both sides at this moment need to kind of step back and take stock and take a deep breath, and that's where I think we are.
If we're thinking about a retooled bilateral relationship, what are the strategic interests that underpin it? I mean, what's this relationship about? I mean, U.S.-Egyptian relations can't be about the bilateral relationship. There has to be something undergirding that. So what is it? What are the convergences of interests that can sustain this bilateral relationship going forward? And I put that to
I would just say that, I think we're having a productive disagreement on this panel, and it relates to a perception of what is going on right now in terms of the roadmap, and maybe also in terms of our interpretation of where Egypt and the U.S. came in the past 40 years. But my concern, I definitely completely agree with you that people in Washington shouldn't be sending orders to Cairo. And that's exactly why in my writings I call for the U.S. just to stop participating in what is basically amounting to the reproduction of authoritarianism in Egypt. It's not to say that Egypt shouldn't be independent. To the contrary, it should absolutely be independent. But if there's going to be a massacre taking place, if there's going to be another Rabaa, if there's going to be more repression of activists from across the whole political spectrum, I don't want the tear gas canisters with "Made in the USA" landing on those activists. And I don't want my tax dollars and the aid money from the U.S. going to that. I want us to pull out, to divest from authoritarianism in Egypt.
To follow up on that, does the United States have interest in maintaining this relationship? And the reverse, what are Egypt's interests in maintaining and continuing perhaps a different kind of relationship? What are Egypt's interests in this? Clearly this isn't a case of charity. Egypt has strategic interests. What are those interests, and why would this relationship continue into the future?
Well, I think we are not talking about Egypt in particular. Egypt is part of a region, and since Second World War, we have a number of things that made the United States interested in the region, and it made the region interested in the United States. Certainly, we have the issue of oil. We have all the waterways, the Suez Canal, and other areas. There is also the American mission in the world to make the world safe for stability in many ways. And I think Egypt was an important anchor, at least since the 1970s, in doing this. And let me say something. Egypt has done a lot of sins, and we didn't manage the country very well. But the picture I'm hearing here, it has nothing to do with Egypt that I left yesterday only. We have Manshiet Nasser, we talked about it. But Cairo is not only Manshiet Nasser. Cairo has about 20 million people in it. There is Gamaliya, there is Sayyid Zainab, there is Masjid Gadida, there is other quarters in Cairo. Even the number we got, 25% of poor, that means we have 75% are not poor out of 85 million people who stayed in Egypt and lived there. I know there is a very spotlight on everything that's bad in Egypt, and I know more than what you know of bad in Egypt, but I think there is a lot of good things in Egypt as well. And Egyptians have tried to deal with underdevelopment and other problems. They did better than some countries, and they did worse than other countries. And so there is nothing special about Egypt, but it will remain the business of Egyptians. That's the point. Are we capable, and we can talk about a number of important interests that we have in the region? Number one interest, how to look at the Middle East after the Arab Spring. Are we going to move from one revolution to another? I heard here in the last panel about judging the government, judging the Muslim Brothers, but not judging the revolutionaries. Who took us from one bad regime to another. That is a cycle that can work out in terms of under very noble and very important and very respectable kind of values, but in reality, it took the country downhill. It took us to the Muslim Brothers. It took us to the Jama'at Islamiyya. It took us to Al-Qaeda. That's so how we will look at the region, at Syria, at Iraq, at Yemen, at Libya. Now the entire region is in fire in many ways. So how we settle that? A second important, I thought, until very recently, that the United States is interested not to have another September 11 again. I am afraid that we are not the one who is ripening or fertilizing the ground for terrorists. Terrorists are there. Many of them are trained by the CIA in Afghanistan. And they came back under Morsi, and Morsi released them from prisons, and they came out and went to Sinai in order to blow up the gas pipeline between us and Israel, and also to kill Egyptian soldiers who were a very minority because of the peace treaty between us and Israel. So here, that is a major interest, because we like it or not, and certainly we dislike it, that having terror as a discipline of its own, based on claimed religious values, are really something of a common interest. Number three, I think Egypt is always very good for American investment and economic values. We have the best General Motors factory in the world. Actually, in the time when General Motors were going to tubes, actually it was making money out of Egypt. So here, there is a lot of economic interest. Egypt has a geopolitical as well as geostrategic values in the region. Egyptian military was not, given the money or made a bright star with the United States. It was to make the United States Army to work in a Middle East environment. And that was every 2 years, in which one of the largest maneuvers made in the entire world after NATO. So here we have, we cannot have it both ways. Let us talk about strategic issues. The word strategic means very important goals, very important strategic posture. And then we say, but these guys got to follow that one. I am with, don't take me wrong. I mean, we want to work very hard to reach into a civic, democratic, and modern country. That's why we are fighting people who did actually try to take the country to the Middle Ages. They want to make Egypt another Iran. I am surprised totally that I didn't find one study in the United States about the Constitution of 2012 with its clauses that's very close and taken from the Iranian Constitution.
On this point, I had huge problems, and I wrote extensively about my problems of that Constitution. But frankly, it was a constitution not supported by the United States. It was a constitution written by Egypt's elected representatives and passed in a referendum. I was quite dismayed. But the notion that this is the fault of the international community, I mean, there is a disconnect where these are the actions of Egyptians. If we want to talk about independence, aren't these the results of independent democratic processes in Egypt as much as we might be dismayed by the outcome?
The sin here is twice or double. Number one, the outcome with the Constitution, I think we might not disagree that it was referring to the direction of a religious state. Second, the procedure of making that Constitution. Number one, the judiciary refused to supervise the referendum, and only the Muslim Brothers members of the judiciary who made the supervision of the referendum. Number two, that there was an actual rigging that took place in that referendum. And never the Constitution Assembly that made that Constitution, really it was approved by the High Constitutional Court. Number three, President Morsi himself, the day he got the Constitution, he said, we will make a commission to amend it. That is the first time in history that the day the Constitution was made, the Constitution was voted for, was at the same day in which the president is telling his people, we need to amend this Constitution, because he knows that the Egyptian people was damn angry because of that Constitution. And it was the first of the revolt of June 30th that was approval of that Constitution in that way. It was not criticized, it was not evaluated, it was not followed by our friends here in Washington.
Amy, there's a lot of talk about aid, but having just recently returned from Egypt and having a pretty wide-ranging set of meetings, it's clear that the diplomatic community and the international community more broadly is out of ideas, not knowing really what to do next. In your estimation, and thinking beyond simply the question of foreign military assistance, what is the sort of near-term agenda for the United States and more broadly for the international community?
I think it has a positive and maybe we could say a negative element. First, the positive element could be the United States and other international actors laying out much more clearly in a way that Egyptians can really understand. I think we've really failed to do this so far. What is possible in a close relationship with the United States? What the international community can offer to Egypt, far beyond foreign aid, which I agree very much with Dr. Abdel Monem is not something that is really that beneficial to Egypt anymore, and it was already a bit on autopilot at the time of the January 25th revolution. It needs to be rethought. But what are all the other things that the international community, and in particular the West, can offer Egypt? Investment, technical support, trade, all kinds of things that are what Egypt really, really needs to succeed, not more foreign aid, whether it's from the Gulf or from the United States. That actually creates the kind of dependency in Egypt that I think Egyptians really don't want. It's unhealthy in the long run. So first, I think the international community, especially the United States, should lay out a vision of what we can really offer an Egypt that is moving in a positive direction politically and economically. In my view, we haven't done that yet. We didn't do it clearly after January 25th, and we haven't done it now. So that's the first thing.
that's a positive vision of what is at stake, what can the benefits be of a strong relationship with a democratizing Egypt, an Egypt that is modernizing and moving in a positive direction, respecting the rights of all of its citizens. In a more negative sense, in my view, it's very important right now that the United States government doesn't do anything, say anything, take any steps that would lend support or condone or endorse in any way what's going on right now in Egypt. I think we should just step back, say a lot less, be much more quiet. Doesn't necessarily mean criticizing every moment. That's not necessarily always appropriate, and it's not even penetrating into Egyptian public opinion or consciousness. I don't think Egyptians want to hear that right now. But we should definitely avoid lending our support or endorsement to what's going on, which unfortunately I think includes a lot of very troubling things. The reinstatement of the state of emergency, a wide crackdown on many Egyptians, not only the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi supporters, but others as well. Many troubling developments. I think that many in Egypt want the United States to support the roadmap and endorse what's happening in Egypt right now, and I don't think the United States should. So I think that should be our sort of near-term horizon, is just pulling back and saying, when you're on a clear democratic path, we will acknowledge it, we will recognize it, and we will congratulate you, but in the meantime, we're not going to kind of contort ourselves to adjust and accept to what's going on when it's not a democratic path right now. Doesn't mean it couldn't be in the future, but right now it's not.
Jason, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just one way to help in terms of aid would be debt relief. For the United States to completely forgive all the debt that Egypt accumulated, especially during the Mubarak years. And that's something that the U.S. has not really put on the table. The only time that Obama did it was to offer $1 billion in debt relief at the time coinciding with an additional loan of $1 billion. So essentially the debt load remained the same. So I think debt relief is a basic idea and something that Egyptians have called for that the U.S. Could do to help.
Just to quickly jump in on that, actually the United States did offer debt relief, and this is something that was very, very unpopular with the United States Congress, and it took a lot of work for the Obama administration to get Congress to agree to a debt swap, which essentially would relieve $1 billion of Egypt's debt to the United States and use those resources for development projects in the interests of the Egyptian people. So it actually would have worked out very well for Egypt, but it's just not possible. It costs the US money to do this. It's not just a writing off of the debt. It costs the US Treasury money. And in this fiscal environment, with what's going on in Egypt now, no matter how much we might want to do that, I can assure you the US Congress is just not going to support that kind of initiative.
But I think that is very instructive then. I mean, if you're not willing to actually spend money in such a basic way that Egyptians are calling for as something that would help relieve the burden in their economy, then what does that say about all the other stuff that you're willing to do?
We did offer that. The Congress authorized a debt swap.
Right.
We presented it to the Egyptian government, and they actually said that what they would like more, because of their urgent fiscal situation, was immediate budget support. So that's actually then what the United States proposed to do, and that is now what's held up in Congress. So actually it was the Egyptian government that said they didn't want the debt relief.
But I may just say one word here. I believe it's premature to talk about investment and relieving aid and debt, and while the political situation is in stagnation. What Egypt is witnessing now, a roadmap that excludes the winning party in last and all free election Egypt witnessed. This is a dilemma for a nightmare. This is a formula for disaster. We talk about investment and the political situation is more important and more appealing for most Egyptians. Economy is always disaster in Egypt. Last 4 decades, Egyptians cope with it and work with it. There is no severe crisis in Egyptian economy. There is severe crisis in political landscape in Egypt by excluding Islamists with maybe popular support, unfortunately. Popular support of excluding Muslim Brotherhood, which leading for a disaster, new generation of terrorists, and unstable, not only Egypt, the entire Middle East.
One of the immediate effects, and this will be my last question, then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. One of the immediate effects of the ouster of Morsi was a reconfiguration of regional relationships, with the UAE and Saudi stepping in to provide, and Kuwait stepping in almost immediately to provide aid to Egypt, and a different relationship emerging with Qatar and Turkey. Do you think, Dr. Abdel, that this is representative of a new regional alignment? Is this a sort of set of relationships that is going to endure going forward? And are you concerned that despite the talk of independence and patriotism and nationalism, that a new kind of dependency is now emerging?
Well, I certainly am worried about any kind of dependency, and I wish that the new era that we are, started in June 30th will go along. And as everybody could be disturbed about, emergency situations, but also I understand the security situation that weren't only another couple months. We are not talking about years. We are not talking about decades. So situation is quite different. However, I want just to get back directly to your point that is our regional alliance. That was the alliance with the United States. Egypt, with the Gulf countries, with Jordan, with Morocco, and now with Libya. I mean, these countries supported Egypt. And that is the core of the moderation alliance that was working with the United States on the peace issues with Israel, on how to deal with the Iranian state, and also with the situation that the United States got trouble with, like in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in other places. I mean, the whole extended and greater Middle East. So that's what we were working. I mean, that was the anchor. And then came the changes that took place in January 2011 and what happened later. And we started to have a very strange and other configurations of power in which a country like Egypt, with all the problems we have, became, like a satellite of a country like, which I with all due respect, like Qatar. And Turkey started to talk about new Ottomanism and coming back to a kind of a Turkish, kind of, I wouldn't say dominance, but I would say an attempt to repeat history in one way or another. But that was something that was, that is the one which was out of place. The original that we are coming, why the Saudis, the Emirates, the Kuwaitis, the Libyans, the Moroccans, and others are supporting Egypt? Because we are on the front line. We are on the front line that we were in the 1990s, and we are now on the front line of fighting terrorism. The terrorism that used religion, actually a lot of Egyptians voted for Morsi. Most of the revolutionaries stood by him. He signed with them something called the Fairmont Agreement, in which he agreed that he will change the Constitutional Assembly. He didn't. He signed with them that he will make a coalition government of all included, political forces. He didn't. He started a process of brotherization in Egypt, and now we are into the process of de-brotherization of Egypt. The Freedom and Justice Party is included. He will not be dissolved. He will be part of the coming elections, and they have the full right to give the votes and come back into the process. To veto the process before it starts and look over all the strategic interests we are talking about, I think it will have a lot of lack of wisdom.
Okay, so let's turn to you probably can weave it in. Let me turn to the crowd. There's microphones that will be passed around. Please state your name and affiliation. And I know there's a good number of Egyptians in the crowd, so I will make this warning real. Please, questions and not speeches and speeches. So please keep it to a question. I'll start off right here in the front row.
Ibrahim Owais from Georgetown University. This question is directed to Dr. Abdel Monem Saeed Ali. Being a prominent figure in the field of journalism in Egypt, to what extent do you think that there is now a strong movement for the freedom of the press, along with the other freedoms, political freedoms, economic freedoms, social freedoms, the political, the most important part here that augment this, what Mustafa Amin used to call Her Majesty journalism. To what extent there is now a movement in Egypt, whether amongst those who are drafting the constitution, to what extent there is a strong movement toward the freedom of press in Egypt?
Well, the Egyptian press and Egyptian media has changed drastically since the beginning of this century. And one of the major changes that took place, that, there was an explosion of technology, so satellite television and electronics, and also the printed press, and their movement from the hands of the states actually to the private and independent sectors. And that happened in the late years of Mubarak, by the way. I mean, it was not new totally. Then came the revolution, and the whole explosion became doubly so. And it took kind of, variations in relationship to the constitution of 2012, and then in the current debate on Egypt. However, I must say that the majority of Egyptian media now, and it is mostly private and independent, I mean, nobody is seeing the Egyptian government television because it's so lousy, and as well as many of the so-called national press, but it is, the private press. There is a very strong coalition that's not understood also in the United States now between the Egyptian people who came out in tens of millions in June 30th and July 26th, and those people and the institutions of the country, which everybody was mocking as being just remnants of the past. That's what we got. The judiciary, the media, the army, the intelligence and security community, Al-Azhar, the Christian Orthodox Church, most of the civil society, save some, and this kind of coalition decided that Egypt is not going to be another Iran. That's not the direction that we started with in 1922. So I think the media now, most of the independent media, is taking, I will say, double positions in a way, supporting the roadmap, almost all of it. Second, they are taking an attempt, serious attempt, not through movement in a sense coming to the street, but writing the articles that's related to the freedom of the press, for instance. So the freedom of the press, the press syndicate, and many of the independent writers started to suggest what kind of changes that will happen on that section of the constitutions. Others are doing the same in other fields. So there is much more organized, institutionalized way of how the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press will be like in the coming constitution.
A quick follow-up on this, and I'll take my prerogative as a moderator, but on the issue of the press, one of the most dismaying developments for me is to see the role of the press on both sides, and I don't distinguish either side here, in terms of propagating conspiracy theories. The idea that Ambassador Ann Patterson is supporting armed terrorism in Egypt, that the United States is actively plotting to partition the country. And these ideas are being touted. The role of the press in stigmatizing dissent. El-Ahram, the magazine, I think it's this weekend now, has on the front, Tabur al-Khamis, the fifth column with pictures of Amr Hamzawi, Mohamed Barad'i. People that might have different views about the current transitional process, but clearly aren't traitors to their country. And so how exactly is Egypt going to democratize with a press that is oftentimes conspiratorial and irresponsible?
That's shameful, and I will agree with you totally that, when you are into a period of political mobility to the most acute state for about 3 years, you are up to, I'm not making any justifications, it is simply shameful, and I'm glad it is not in Masry Youm.
Question right over here.
Hi, Tarek Radwan with the Atlantic Council. I wanted to approach this idea of go back to this idea of foreign funding. Mohamed, you mentioned that we can't talk about investment and so forth with political stagnation. One of the things that counters political stagnation is an active civil society, yet civil society in Egypt lacks a lot of times the resources and capabilities to act on domestic funding. And so I wanted to get each of your perspectives on the situation of foreign-funded NGOs today. And I mean, I know there were reports of activists who were being investigated, which were subsequently denied. What is that state now? How is foreign funding, does foreign funding to NGOs in Egypt today still make sense?
You want to start?
Let's remember what happened in December 29th of 2011. Egyptian security apparatus raided several offices of NGOs, mostly funded, foreign-funded NGO, and they have this famous trial, and I believe 19 people sent to what, average 5 years in jail, and some of them maybe in the audience here can't put a foot in Egypt because they'll be arrested immediately. But I would like to distinguish between the government foreign-funded and non-government foreign-funded. The government-funded, and I will classify here any fund given by US aid or US government or affiliated organization, are not welcome by most Egyptians. I believe the outcomes of this funding and the way they produce, report, and do some investigation is highly appreciated. However, it doesn't make them depend on local funding. You give them easy funding from US government or US funded organization, and you didn't teach them how to raise fund in Egypt, and that was the case for the last 30 years. And that's why I believe most Egyptians don't like it. Besides, I doubt there is any government fund without agenda or some goals, whether you give it to NGO or to government. That's no secret. If I give aid to any government or to any NGO, I should have some expectations. Otherwise, it's not a charity. Let's admit it, it's not a charity, the foreign fund. So let's distinguish between the government funded, which most Egyptians won't like, and the non-government funded. Like Ford Foundation works in Egypt with great reputation last 60 years, and they do a lot of good job in Cairo and outside Cairo, and no one touches them. The security during Mubarak or SCAF or Morsi, no one come close to them because they are not government. But the government funded organization is very problematic, and I believe it makes more hurt than more help to most Egyptians and what cause they serve.
Anybody else want to touch on that?
Sure. I agree with Mohamed that foreign funding of Egyptian NGOs is very controversial, and it's not widely popular in Egypt, to say the least. However, it is part of international law and norms that NGOs have the right to associate with and receive funding from any partners around the world, as long as that funding, does not promote terrorism or violence. So even though it may be very unpopular, it still is a right. It's part of the freedom of association. It's something that the United States and other countries should defend, in my view. And in that regard, I think that the verdict in early June in the NGO trial convicting 43 American and Egyptian and other nationals working for US and German funded democracy organizations in Egypt really is a thorn in the side of US-Egyptian relations. It certainly isn't a front burner issue. It's not something that is driving calculations about the relationship going forward. But the fact that this verdict was handed down and American citizens and others were convicted for basically carrying out peaceful democracy education activities with the full knowledge of the Egyptian government is something that's really, really shameful. And I think until that verdict is corrected or resolved in some way, this will be a block in a really, really strong and full relationship with Egypt. And in that regard, I also wanted to follow on what you said, Michael, about the press. It has been incredibly disturbing in these recent weeks to see what has been in the Egyptian press about the United States government, our president, our ambassador, our other officials. This is another reason why I think the United States can't continue business as usual with Egypt right now. These articles are in the state-owned press as well and on privately owned media as well. I very much appreciate and welcome what you said to condemn this. But until an Egyptian official says this in Egypt to Egyptians, then I won't really believe that this isn't going to stop anytime soon. It's very, very, very disturbing, and it actually doesn't bring credit to Egypt.
All the way to the back of the room.
Hi, Mohamed Yunus from the Gallup organization. Amy, this question is for you. I noticed that you ended your last point on sort of what gives credit to Egypt. I think here in Washington, we have a tendency to focus on what Egypt is doing wrong, which is very fair, and I think there are a lot of mistakes being made. But the sentiment in the region really is that the Obama administration has just completely dropped the ball in the Arab Spring, completely. They really do not have a clear vision and position on what the U.S. government's role should be in the region, particularly with Egypt. Could you specifically sort of share with us what you think the Obama administration, from today moving forward, should do to rehabilitate that image? Should they try to rehabilitate that image? Because I think that when you say sort of stepping back, a lot of us who have been following Egypt very closely feel like that stepping back really happened probably about 18 to 20 months ago. Because there hasn't been sort of a clear position on a lot of the things that have happened in Egypt coming out of the U.S. government, with this idea that we're no longer the central player in Egypt, and Egyptians sort of, this is their process and they need to own it. So moving forward, specifically, what do you think President Obama should be doing and saying to the Egyptian people?
Well, as I said, at this very moment, I actually don't think the United States should be, I think we should say a lot less. I think our messages are just getting lost in Egypt. I don't think they're penetrating. I don't think they're getting through. As I said, I think the immediate things the United States should do should be to suspend our aid program until Egypt is clearly returning to or on a democratic path. I think we should speak out at the appropriate time forthrightly about the things in Egypt that we think are concerning in terms of democracy and human rights. I think we should offer, as I said, a clear vision of what the United States could provide or could work with Egypt on once relations are on a better path and Egypt is more clearly on a trajectory to democracy. This was actually something I thought we should have done under Morsi. It's not limited to this new Egyptian government. I thought we should have done this earlier, to offer something, to provide an incentive to show what is at stake with a good in terms of a good relationship with the United States. Those are the things I think we should do. I think what we shouldn't do is rush to kind of embrace or approve or sort of accept exactly what's going on in Egypt now politically. That's for Egyptians to decide, and they're going to do what they want to do, but the United States doesn't necessarily need to be actively supporting it in any way. In my view, it's not in our strategic interests.
Left-hand side.
Hi, my name is Ahmad Salim, and I have just a question for the panel regarding to what's going on in Egypt right now and our relation with Egypt vis-a-vis the rise of the Russian and China in terms of the region. So,
let me tell you something. Egyptian military officials love United States. They love to come here. They love to come train here, spend some time, learn English. If they ask them, would you prefer to spend some months in Moscow or Beijing instead of Washington? They would say boldly no. So nothing here to fear of Russian and Chinese influence. I believe it's a mess. There is love relation between the military of Egypt and the United States, and it won't change anytime soon.
American, and I love both countries. What I'm saying here, I'm saying the U.S. influence is diminishing a lot because of so many reasons, and then at the same time you get the rise of the another players like China and Russia. So, well, first of all, I guess let me clarify the question.
Are Russia and China going to play a bigger role in Egypt going forward?
Sure, I will agree. U.S. influence and leverage is declining in the entire region, not only in Egypt. However, there is no alternative or vacuum to fill by other forces, meaning here Russia and China. I believe the mess of more influence of China and Russia in the region is mess. It's not real. There is huge distance between the political culture and the political establishment between the two countries, Russia and China from one side, and Egypt and the most Arab countries. The Egyptian military and elite are Western-oriented, and there is no threat of switching their compass toward Russia or China anytime soon.
So we are Western-oriented now?
Yes.
Thank you.
The elite Egyptian, as I said.
I just, aside from the nice inclinations of Egyptians to come to the United States, which is a great country, outside of that, I don't think only it was Morsi who started to play that game, is to come back to the game of playing. He went to Russia, he went to China, he went to Brazil, he went to India. And there is some school of thought in Egypt, we got to diversify our relationship. And I'm one of the people who say, let us have a good relationship with everybody, particularly with the United States. And in that sense, I'm saying that that's a school of thought, but always yielded not much. I mean, there is very little in Russia, there is very little in China to offer to Egypt. And the Egyptian industry and the Egyptian army and the Egyptian all trade, banking, investment schools are much more tuned to the American and Western alliance at large. And in the last 4 decades, as I said, we have a very neat kind of a relationship that I thought it was helping for both sides, Egypt and the West as well. Because Egypt, no matter what, it is weak and faced with problems. It is a very important legitimizing factor in the Middle East. Who has good relationship with Egypt is ultimately will have a good relationship with the rest of the region.
Woman on the right-hand side here.
Hi. I can see from our conversation here that there is a link between the media in Egypt and the democracy. And a lot of people here are really bothered by our media, a private one. But I just want you to comment on what is the media here in the United States is doing. I see that the media here is bashing the administration and their stand in Egypt much more than Egyptians. So I'd like to know your comment and if you want to link it to democracy too or not. Thanks.
Well, I'm not the chairman of the Washington Post, unfortunately. So don't look at me.
I will have something to say about American media. I believe most American media news about Egypt are from Egypt-based American journalists who are in the ground there. And they report, in my opinion, what they see and what they witness. And the big story of Egypt in last 2 months, the killing of the sit-in Rabaa and in Nahda. And reporting the killing is big news anywhere in the world. When you kill few hundred people or 1,600, as some people accounted that, it's huge front page news anywhere in the face of the earth. It doesn't matter who kills them, were they armed or not, what's their goal, what's their assessment of political scenarios or what they want. That's not important for reporters. I do some reporting as well. When there is killing, especially when it comes in hand of the security apparatus, it's huge news. And that's why most Egyptians criticize the American coverage, which I believe, reading it from here, is very balanced and wise. They criticize Morsi, they criticize the scabs, they criticize the killing, and they criticize everybody who doesn't do good stuff by their Western-oriented and Western standard. Trying to apply Egyptian standard for American reporting, it's a mistake, and that's what I believe most Egyptians are doing. Try to apply Egyptian standard of journalism to American one, and here we don't have Ministry of Information to control American media and tell them this red line, this here registration you can't get, and that's not the case in the United States. I believe it's very fair reporting about the event in Egypt in eye of most American here.
That's okay. Okay. Lala.
No, I say what I believe in.
Let's just sorry, we're gonna have to move on. No. We're not gonna take speeches from the floor.
It's widely reported. It's widely reported in American media. Widely reported in American media burning of the church.
Nothing was mentioned.
It was widely reported as well.
They were fair. They were not fair. They were unfair, and you know it.
Good.
Jawad, I wanted to leave this question because I want to put it in my panel, but I couldn't. In 2011, we came, and our first priority was economy, economy, economy. And the U.S. did not support the economy. And in our perspective, that means that they did not support the revolution. So when do you think, actually, I mean, I'm optimistic about Egypt's future no matter what, and I know we will do it anyways. But the U.S., are they willing to actually, are they going to ever, like really seriously, decide to really push for and invest in Egypt and support the actual economy in Egypt? And there's other ways than doing U.S. aid and other stuff, and you understand what I mean. Or they're just going to wait to see whoever's going to come in power and they like, and then they're going to go about it.
So does anybody in the international community
As
have
for
a
Amy,
real plan to support the Egyptian economy? Whoever wants to take that.
I take your point. I agree with it very much. I think there are really two things that the United States can offer to Egypt that would really make a difference to Egypt's future: trade and investment. Investment really has to do with how business people perceive the political and security environment in Egypt. There isn't that much the United States government can do that really is in the hands of Egyptians. So there's actually a lot of American businesses that were interested in investing in Egypt. And in fact, about almost exactly a year ago, the US Chamber of Commerce organized one of the largest business delegations ever in the world to Egypt. 100 CEOs and top leaders of top American businesses. They went to Egypt. They had a very, very productive week there. As they were giving their press conference, a mob of protesters was breaking into the US Embassy. The Egyptian security forces were, unfortunately, nowhere to be seen. That sent a terrible message, and it actually undid the positive messages that those business leaders had taken away, and they were very reluctant to invest. So this is really something that the US actually would very much like to encourage. Egypt has so much going for it in terms of talent and human capital and resources and strategic location. But when businesses look at Egypt, they want to see security, stability, and that's not happening right now. In terms of trade, I think the Obama administration made a big, big mistake, in my view, by deciding not to offer a free trade agreement, to put that on the table as something that Egypt and the US could work together toward. It's a very complex process, it's very hard, difficult, but for a variety of reasons, mostly having to do with domestic politics, the Obama administration decided not to offer that to Egypt early on. And I think that was a mistake. I think we should have done that. That would have been something very positive for Egypt to work toward. And I hope in the future that might be back on the table if conditions change.
Jason, you want to add something?
Yeah, if I could respond to your question. I mean, I find myself being in the position of the Debbie Downer on this panel, but so be it. I think the quick answer to your question is no, that within the US government there are not the kinds of incentives to provide serious economic relief to Egypt, regardless of what type of regime is in Egypt. I mean, the US enjoyed very friendly relations with Mubarak, but the structural adjustment programs and didn't go very far. They weren't helpful for the kind of Egyptians that you're working with, and that in Menshi and also. And I don't think, we're not going to see a free trade agreement. That didn't happen under the Bush administration. And in research for my book, David Welch explained it to me very plainly. He said, if you look around the region, the U.S. signs, the region of the Middle East, the U.S. signs free trade agreements with countries with which it does not trade. So that's when you're going to get a free trade agreement, when there's no trade to begin with. With Egypt, the U.S. has a trade surplus, so there's no material incentive there for the kinds of trade that would be beneficial. So I think that's important to clarify, because otherwise there is a sort of risk of moral hazard in which Egyptians might keep expecting that somehow U.S. aid is going to bring a bailout or is going to bring relief. And so, although I deliver a dismal message, I mean, I hope to some extent clarity can be helpful.
There is a middle way that I suggested before. I mean, many times that I got here to Washington, was that the American aid should be going to American corporations. I mean, instead of the money is going to Egypt, you use it as an incentive to American business to do business in Egypt. Particularly, as I said, we have a lot of success stories. So that is the kind of relationship that I look for, in which we will have a win-win situation. The United States got a surplus, and also our exports to the United States improved by the quiz agreement, which was a quasi kind of a free trade area in certain kind of commodities that's made by Egyptians, but with an Israeli component. So we got actually to the United States over $1 billion of exports as a result of this kind of an agreement. So that's the middle way. I mean, that's one of the ways in which you are not giving anybody else. You are giving to your own people, your own workers, and your own investors.
Okay, let me take two questions together here because we're running out of time. Gentleman in the middle. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
My name is Akram Zind from Egyptian Americans for Democracy and Human Rights. My question is taking into consideration three different facts that currently, right now, which number one, shutting down the media channels, all the media channels that might have a different opinion from all the media channels that currently being permitted to work and allowed. Second, having taken into consideration the arrest of the young women in Egypt, with a few days ago, the youngest detained 6-year-old girl from Cairo, Tajammu al-Khamis, New Cairo, last week, and this is the youngest detained ever in Egyptian history because of her political opinion or being out against the coup. If she would say that.
Let's get to the question.
The third one, classifying Egypt as a second worst country in killing journalists. What is the role of the current media with all its different types in protecting the civil rights of the Egyptians? Thank you.
We take one more question and we'll bundle them together right here in the middle.
My name is Safiuddin Hamid at Chatham University, and my question is actually to Jason. I like the goal you articulated, that we should ask the regime in Egypt to at least stop producing more terrorists. How to operationalize that? What would be your operation plan to do that after 3,000 or 4,000 killed?
Jason,
Okay, so we'll start with that question. Well, I think it begins with something that's a theme that's run through several of the panels today, which would be an inclusive political process, which would mean ending immediately the crackdown against the Muslim Brotherhood, releasing Muslim Brotherhood leaders, allowing Muslim Brotherhood figures who are in self-imposed exile to return, basically getting them to buy into the political process so that they and their cadres will feel included, and so that you will not have a return to the 1990s where you just basically have a single-party state with nominal participation from non-Islamist movements, and then you have the Muslim Brotherhood basically being in jail. So I think that would be a basic step. It does not require it doesn't require a magic wand. It just requires political will.
Anybody else have thoughts on the first comment?
I asked many of my American friends to tell me what the United States is doing or can do with a secret organization that nobody knows about its membership or its finances or its international connections. And also if it is proven in the entire history of it that it is keen on keeping weapons. And I agree that we have to be inclusive. And in this way, we got to apply the law to the letter to anyone who disturbed the process of marching towards democracy. But in the same time, we should not allow, again, and I am repeating here how existential it is, what happened in Germany, what happened in Iran, fascist organizations got capabilities of really torpedoing the future of countries. And they pay at the end a very heavy price. The Freedom and Justice Party will participate in the coming elections of Egyptian parliament. And I agree with people who will say, even with all the martyrdom kind of talk in the religious channels, it should be allowed to be aired. Egyptian, I think, body politic, the current balance of power in Egypt allows that there is no one should be taken out of freedom of expression and getting out its word out.
Take two last questions. We'll start in the back over here. Okay, Hussam, go first.
Thank you. This is a question for Dr. Saeed again. Dr. Saeed, after January 2011, you wrote a series of articles with the title "Why We Failed" or "How We Failed," and I think you were probably, and you still are, the only senior figure of Mubarak's party and Mubarak's regime who has actually attempted to at this introspection. I'm not talking about an apology, but at least an acknowledgement of the participation and the failure. But your analysis was based on saying that within the regime there were the forces of reform to which you belonged, and there were the forces of the status quo. So my question now is, now that these forces, 2 years later, has the balance shifted at all? Have the forces of the status quo, and particularly the establishment of the security, intelligence, military establishment, have they changed positions on any of the issues that you tried to push from within Mubarak's party and failed?
Well, we're going to take a couple more, just so we'll get to two last questions, then we'll start here, right next, right over here, and we'll take your question to wrap it up.
Hi, my name is Samah Alphonse from the Arab League in DC. The panel is about engaging the international community. So I'd like to pick the panel's mind of what should Egypt do in a nutshell to engage the international community, just in 1, 2, 3 steps. Thank you.
Last question over here. Give 1 second for the microphone.
Thank you very much. My name is Mustafa Burai. Very quick question. As Egyptian, I agree with the statement that the Egyptian-American relation cannot go as business as usual, because I really believe that the US is taking too much for too little. $1.3 billion a year or military aid, most of it is F-16 fighter jets that are obsolete, US Army is not using, with the plans to retire whatever they have in the future years. The rest is M1, A1 tanks. All these people with the reports that we're seeing are not very beneficial right now to the Egyptian military. On the contrast, the US is getting things like expedited access to Suez Canal and other benefits in Egypt. So I really believe that and also tired of whatever the US-Egyptian relation comes on, people talk about the aid, as if this is the only thing. What I would like to hear from now on from US government and administration is when US-Egyptian relation comes, they talk about things like investment in Egypt, mutual relation, trade, free trade. That's what we should be talking about. My question to Dr. Abdel Monem Said, do you think there is in the foreseeable future that we would start hearing from the Egyptian administration that we are sick and tired of this and this relation cannot be going as usual? Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we start from the end, Jason, and we'll come down the line.
Okay, well, to respond to the prior question in the back, and it relates to this last question too. I guess if you're asking my recommendations for engaging the international community or engaging the United States, I would just offer one recommendation, which would be start refusing US aid and all the strings that come attached with it.
I just called at the beginning for a serious assessment, including the aid issue. We should not outright talk about the F-16 and all the weapons in this way. It depends on many strategic balances. So I think we need an assessment for sure, but this assessment should be based on a 40 years of friendship and real strategic and even human being to human being alliance between Americans and the Egyptians. I mean, all the polls that made by major American corporations on public opinion polls were saying that Egypt were in a favorable place by the American public. As Hussam Bagat was saying about, I did wrote a series of articles about why did we fail during Mubarak era, in which I assessed, the situation. Now it is very difficult to make another assessment, and I do some assessments, but it can be wrong as anything I write. That's because the situation is very fluid. For 3 years, everybody is in many ways, moving in. We have been too wrong and we have been too right. And between these two poles, I think it is the time now for Egyptians. That's why, foreign help will do little except in technical issues. I wish very much, for instance, the Indian government is offering us an electronic system that they used in India for making sure of the integrity of the election process, for instance. That's the kind of help that I think will be providing monitors for the elections and also assessments of our constitutional build-up. All these are things that can be helpful, and to settle for a country that we might not be, in complete admiration of it, but at least can achieve, some of the most important things that we want to have, particularly, as I said, civic, democratic, and modern.
I believe the structure of the aid as we know now, it's poisoning the relation between Egypt and the United States. And as long as it is there in the current fashion, it will still poisoning the relation between the two sides. So if you want to have good relation between Cairo and Washington, get rid of this way of giving aid to Egypt. Go fund science lab in Upper Egypt universities or high school. It's very poor, and there is no anything students can learn in public school in Upper Egypt. Most Egyptians will value that highly. And if you spread English language in Upper Egypt, which very poor part of Egypt, instead of supporting the military, you will be highly appreciated by most Egyptians. But giving the aid as it is, it's poisoning the relation. US Congress, especially the House, believe they are entitled to tell Egyptians what they should do in any aspect of Egyptian political life because of this aid. And the Egyptian government from its side doesn't educate American public and policy community in the House, especially what US get in return of this aid. US have at least an average 100 air flight access through Egypt airspace a year, meaning 3.3 a day. That's huge. That's very valuable for the Department of Defense, but most people of the Congress don't know that, and Egyptian state doesn't promote it here in Washington for a lot of reasons which I fail to understand. So changing the formula of the aid is the only way to have healthy relation between the two countries.
In terms of what Egypt can do to position itself to attract support from the international community, if it wants that support, an Egypt that is open to the world, not xenophobic, an Egypt that is tolerant, an Egypt that is trying to promote and activate the talents of its youth that make up the bulk of its population, an Egypt that is clearly on a path to political stability, that's a more stable environment where investors can come and that there are reliable rules of the game and processes in place, an Egypt that doesn't resort to violence to solve its political problems. This is the kind of Egypt that the world will want to support and look favorably upon. The Egypt that has unfolded in the past couple of years, unfortunately, is not that Egypt. And I think that the real Egypt is struggling to get out, and it's along the lines of the vision that I described. But unfortunately, it's not the Egypt that we're seeing today.
Thanks for the questions, and thank you to the panel.
Just to wrap up, there have been a lot of differences of opinion expressed here today, but I think one thing we can all agree upon is that this conference has been exceptional in terms of the diversity of views and opinion expressed here today. And I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our moderators who've come from Cairo and Canada and Texas and elsewhere for sharing their views and insights. This conference has been on fire on Twitter sphere, with many people in Egypt tweeting that they wish that this kind of conference could take place in Cairo. And we hope it can in the future, but in the meantime, MEI is deeply honored to be able to host this depth of conversation about a country that is very dear to all of us here. So thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to you coming to our annual conference on November 15th. Thank you.